The night settled over Claybrook, Missouri, with a silence that was almost suspicious. It wasn't the gentle peace of a small town at rest. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are waiting for something terrible to happen. The year was 1901, and the air smelled faintly of dust, tobacco, and the river mud that never quite dried at the edge of town. Edward Branson walked down Main Street that evening, his shadow stretching long across the uneven dirt road. His boots were old, cracked at the soles, and his clothes, simple, faded overalls, clung to him with the scent of sweat and smoke. He carried no weapons. He didn't need them, at least not tonight. What drew people's eyes to him wasn't his size, nor the faint scar that ran down his cheek. It was the smile, that calm, unsettling smile that seemed to cut deeper than any knife ever could. The townsfolk whispered about him behind porches and shutters. They said Edward was once a slave on the Branson plantation, just a few miles north of town. When freedom finally came, he didn't run. He didn't pack his things or wander off like the others. He stayed and kept working for the same family that once owned him. That was what made people uncomfortable. Freedom should have changed a man. But Edward, he changed in ways no one could understand. By day, he worked the fields, silent and steady. By night, he sat alone on the edge of the river, singing to himself in a low voice that carried across the water. It wasn't a hymn, not quite. It sounded more like a story told through pain, the kind that keeps a man from sleeping. Some nights children swore they heard him laughing softly to himself, even when no one was around. What no one in Claybrook knew was that Edward Branson had already made a decision, a quiet, deliberate decision that would drown the town in blood before the summer was through. That first night began with a single act. At the edge of the Branson property, under the wide arch of the oak trees, stood an old barn that hadn't been used since before the war. Its doors sagged open, wood splintered and grey. The animals were long gone, but the smell of hay and dust still lingered. Edward entered carrying a lantern, the faint gold light falling across his face, illuminating that same polite smile. Inside was Thomas Branson, the youngest of the Branson brothers, a drunk, a man of 25, and a cruel one at that. He didn't see Edward at first. He was too busy fumbling with the bottle in his hand, mumbling curses about his family and his luck. When he finally looked up, he caught the gleam of the lantern and squinted. "Edward, that you?" he slurred. "Get me some more whiskey, boy." Edward didn't move. He just stood there, that faint smile never faltering. "No, sir," he said quietly. "I think you've had enough." The boy laughed, but there was no humor in it, just arrogance, the kind that comes from a life without consequences. "You forget your place, Branson," Thomas said. "You think you're one of us now?" Edward took a step closer. The heat from the lantern flickered across his eyes, and for the first time Thomas noticed something wrong there. A stillness too steady, like the calm before a storm. Edward lowered the lantern to the dirt floor and spoke in that same even tone. "I remember my place," he whispered. "I've been remembering it every day of my life. The fight was short, brutal, and suffocatingly quiet. When the lantern finally tipped over, the barn filled with a thick golden smoke. Outside, frogs kept croaking. The wind kept moving through the cornfields, and the town for a while longer slept in peace. By morning the sun had risen over Claybrook, painting the sky in tones of fire and gold. A young boy found the body, what was left of Thomas Branson, lying beside the burned-out barn. The sheriff came riding down before noon, already sweating, and the townspeople gathered near the edge of the field, whispering and crossing themselves. "Must have been an accident," the sheriff said, though his tone carried doubt. But behind every whisper the same name fluttered through the crowd: Edward Branson. That evening, Edward stood outside his small cabin, staring at the collapsing barn in the distance. The smoke rose in thin ribbons, carrying with it the first traces of rumor and fear. He didn't hide. He didn't run. Instead, he smiled again, soft, almost gentle, and whispered to no one, "One down." The sun sank low behind him, staining the fields red. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to happen in Claybrook. Dogs went missing. Someone found bloody footprints near the old well. The blacksmith's wife swore she saw Edward standing outside her window one night, just smiling through the glass before walking away into the fog. Everyone noticed how the laughter in his voice grew louder with each passing day. The sheriff wanted to question him, but something in his gut told him to wait, to watch first. He'd seen eyes like Edward's before, years ago, during the war. They belonged to men who had already made peace with killing. When the second body appeared, no one doubted anymore. That was when the fear in Claybrook turned to chaos, and through it all, Edward Branson kept smiling, as if the world was finally becoming exactly what he always knew it was meant to be. Dawn broke heavy over Claybrook, the sky streaked with pink and grey like the colours of an open wound. The river ran slow that morning, its muddy waters carrying twigs, leaves, and the faint scent of decay that no one wanted to talk about. People had already started locking their doors before sunset. Children were told to stay off the roads, and still Edward Branson moved freely through town, as if nothing at all had happened. The sheriff sat at his desk, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, staring at the blackened timbers of the Branson barn through his office window. The case made no sense. There were no witnesses, no prints, no weapon. Just what the fire hadn't eaten, and the whispers. Always the whispers. He'd known Edward since he was a boy, back when the man barely spoke, when his only dream was to see the river one more time. The sheriff rubbed his chin, trying to bury a memory that had begun to surface. A whip cracking, the sound of a woman's scream, and young Edward standing motionless at the edge of a cotton field, his hands clenched into fists. That morning, Edward came into town carrying a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. Men stepped aside as he walked past. He nodded politely to each one, saying "Morning," with that same gentle smile that made their stomachs twist. He stopped by the blacksmith's shop, the sound of hammer and iron echoing through the crisp air. "Need a sharpening, Mr. Lewis," he said, placing something wrapped in cloth on the counter. The blacksmith hesitated before pulling the fabric back. It was a scythe blade, dull at the edge but otherwise well kept. He looked at Edward, waiting for an explanation that never came. "Harvest's over," Lewis muttered. "Not for me," Edward replied softly. Later that day, the sheriff rode out to the riverbank. The sun was merciless, beating down on the dry earth and the thick smell of mud. A few fishermen stood along the water, their lines quiet, faces pale. When he approached, one of them just pointed downstream without a word. That's where they found Samuel Branson, the second brother. He'd been missing since the night before. The body lay tangled in reeds, half submerged, eyes open to the sun. His hands were tied behind him with coarse rope. The water had washed away most of the blood, but not all. The sheriff removed his hat and said nothing. "Someone did this slow," one of the fishermen whispered. "Didn't want him dead at once." The sheriff looked toward the deeper woods, where the shadows of cypress trees rippled against the current. Something in his gut turned cold. The signs were the same: restraint, precision, intention. Whoever had done this wasn't in a hurry. They wanted to watch, to savor. When the sheriff returned to town, he found Edward sitting outside the general store, rocking slowly in a chair with a Bible in his lap. He smiled as the sheriff approached, tipping his hat. "Morning, Sheriff," he said calmly. "Morning, Edward," the sheriff replied, forcing steady words. "Heard you've been down by the river recently." Edward looked up, eyes glinting in the light. "River's where I go to think. Find anything?" The sheriff pressed. "Found peace," he said simply. The sheriff let the silence linger too long. Behind him, a few of the store's patrons watched from the doorway. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Edward stood, brushed dust from his trousers, and nodded again. "If you need me, Sheriff, I'll be home." When he walked away, the sheriff finally exhaled. He had seen many kinds of killers in his time, but none so calm. None that smiled like that. That night, thunder rolled across Missouri. Heavy rain followed, washing through the streets of Claybrook and flooding the lower fields. The storm made it hard to hear, which is why no one noticed the screams at first. In the dark, Edward stood outside his cabin, water dripping from his hat brim. He held the scythe handle, now fitted with the sharpened blade, gleaming silver under the lightning. Inside the cabin, the old Branson matriarch had come to pray with him, or so they said. She'd brought him food. She didn't come back out. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and clean. The sheriff and his men followed muddy tracks up the hill to Edward's home. The door stood ajar. The Bible lay open on the table, pages warped from dampness. A pot simmered on the hearth, still warm. There was no sign of Edward, only a faint trace of something metallic in the air. It took them hours to follow the tracks leading away from the cabin. They wound through the woods past the sawmill and ended at the river again. Beneath a sycamore tree, half covered by wild vines, they found a woman's bonnet and a brooch engraved with the letter B. The sheriff's horse shifted nervously, snorting. He turned toward the trees and saw him. Edward stood there, maybe 15 feet away, soaked, tired, but smiling. The scythe rested across his shoulders, casual as a farmer heading home. "You shouldn't have come, Sheriff," he called out. "Not yet. Drop it, Edward," the sheriff barked. "Now." Edward tilted his head, that same polite confusion crossing his face, as if the man had just asked him to recite a prayer. "You think I'm just killing, Sheriff?" he said softly. "No, I'm setting things right. They made me what I am. Now they will remember what they created." Before the sheriff could reply, Edward turned and slipped back into the trees. The men chased, shouting his name, but the woods swallowed him as if he'd never been there. For days people searched. Men rode with lanterns through the back roads and fields, dogs howling into the dark. Each night someone claimed to see him, by the cemetery gate near the mill down by the water. Always smiling, always silent. Then the fires began. Barns burned. Wagons were overturned. Panic swallowed Claybrook whole. And on the 5th night after the storm, a note appeared nailed to the church door, written in rough, uneven letters. "Justice comes at night." The smile is the last thing they'll see. There was no signature, but no one needed one. Edward Branson was no longer a man to them. He was the storm that had never truly passed, and Claybrook, Missouri was only beginning to understand what judgment looked like when it wore a smile. Dawn broke heavy over Claybrook, the sky streaked with pink and grey like the colours of an open wound. The river ran slow that morning, its muddy waters carrying twigs, leaves, and the faint scent of decay that no one wanted to talk about. People had already started locking their doors before sunset. Children were told to stay off the roads, and still Edward Branson moved freely through town, as if nothing at all had happened. The sheriff sat at his desk, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, staring at the blackened timbers of the Branson barn through his office window. The case made no sense. There were no witnesses, no prints, no weapon. Just what the fire hadn't eaten, and the whispers. Always the whispers. He'd known Edward since he was a boy, back when the man barely spoke, when his only dream was to see the river one more time. The sheriff rubbed his chin, trying to bury a memory that had begun to surface. A whip cracking, the sound of a woman's scream, and young Edward standing motionless at the edge of a cotton field, his hands clenched into fists. That morning, Edward came into town carrying a burlap sack slung over his shoulder. Men stepped aside as he walked past. He nodded politely to each one, saying "morning," with that same gentle smile that made their stomachs twist. He stopped by the blacksmith's shop, the sound of hammer and iron echoing through the crisp air. "Need a sharpening, Mr. Lewis," he said, placing something wrapped in cloth on the counter. The blacksmith hesitated before pulling the fabric back. It was a scythe blade, dull at the edge but otherwise well kept. He looked at Edward, waiting for an explanation that never came. "Harvest's over," Lewis muttered. "Not for me," Edward replied softly. Later that day, the sheriff rode out to the riverbank. The sun was merciless, beating down on the dry earth and the thick smell of mud. A few fishermen stood along the water, their lines quiet, faces pale. When he approached, one of them just pointed downstream without a word. That's where they found Samuel Branson, the second brother. He'd been missing since the night before. The body lay tangled in reeds, half submerged, eyes open to the sun. His hands were tied behind him with coarse rope. The water had washed away most of the blood, but not all. The sheriff removed his hat and said nothing. "Someone did this slow," one of the fishermen whispered. "Didn't want him dead at once." The sheriff looked toward the deeper woods, where the shadows of cypress trees rippled against the current. Something in his gut turned cold. The signs were the same: restraint, precision, intention. Whoever had done this wasn't in a hurry. They wanted to watch, to savor. When the sheriff returned to town, he found Edward sitting outside the general store, rocking slowly in a chair with a Bible in his lap. He smiled as the sheriff approached, tipping his hat. "Morning, Sheriff," he said calmly. "Morning, Edward," the sheriff replied, forcing steady words. "Heard you've been down by the river recently." Edward looked up, eyes glinting in the light. "River's where I go to think. Find anything?" The sheriff pressed. "Found peace," he said simply. The sheriff let the silence linger too long. Behind him, a few of the store's patrons watched from the doorway. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Edward stood, brushed dust from his trousers, and nodded again. "If you need me, Sheriff, I'll be home." When he walked away, the sheriff finally exhaled. He had seen many kinds of killers in his time, but none so calm. None that smiled like that. That night, thunder rolled across Missouri. Heavy rain followed, washing through the streets of Claybrook and flooding the lower fields. The storm made it hard to hear, which is why no one noticed the screams at first. In the dark, Edward stood outside his cabin, water dripping from his hat brim. He held the scythe handle, now fitted with the sharpened blade, gleaming silver under the lightning. Inside the cabin, the old Branson matriarch had come to pray with him, or so they said. She'd brought him food. She didn't come back out. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the air heavy and clean. The sheriff and his men followed muddy tracks up the hill to Edward's home. The door stood ajar. The Bible lay open on the table, pages warped from dampness. A pot simmered on the hearth, still warm. There was no sign of Edward, only a faint trace of something metallic in the air. It took them hours to follow the tracks leading away from the cabin. They wound through the woods past the sawmill and ended at the river again. Beneath a sycamore tree, half covered by wild vines, they found a woman's bonnet and a brooch engraved with the letter B. The sheriff's horse shifted nervously, snorting. He turned toward the trees and saw him. Edward stood there, maybe 15 feet away, soaked, tired, but smiling. The scythe rested across his shoulders, casual as a farmer heading home. "You shouldn't have come, Sheriff," he called out. "Not yet. Drop it, Edward," the sheriff barked. "Now." Edward tilted his head, that same polite confusion crossing his face, as if the man had just asked him to recite a prayer. "I think I'm just killing, Sheriff," he said softly. "No, I'm setting things right. They made me what I am. Now they will remember what they created." Before the sheriff could reply, Edward turned and slipped back into the trees. The men chased, shouting his name, but the woods swallowed him as if he'd never been there. For days people searched. Men rode with lanterns through the back roads and fields, dogs howling into the dark. Each night someone claimed to see him, by the cemetery gate near the mill down by the water. Always smiling, always silent. Then the fires began. Barns burned. Wagons were overturned. Panic swallowed Claybrook whole. And on the 5th night after the storm, a note appeared nailed to the church door, written in rough, uneven letters. "Justice comes at night." The smile is the last thing they'll see. There was no signature, but no one needed one. Edward Branson was no longer a man to them. He was the storm that had never truly passed, and Claybrook, Missouri was only beginning to understand what judgment looked like when it wore a smile. Claybrook woke to a restless dawn. The sun stretched across the rooftops, casting long shadows that made the town look older, haunted even in daylight. The church bell rang at 7, but no one came. Fear had silenced even God's call. Every family locked themselves in, every porch empty. Only the wind moved, twisting through the cracked fences, whispering the same name over and over, Edward. Sheriff Randall Price rode slowly down Main Street, the leather on his saddle creaking in rhythm with his troubled breath. He hadn't told a soul about the cross or the note from the night before. The wooden token sat heavy in his coat pocket, pressing against his ribs like guilt itself. He was exhausted, haunted by the realization that Edward Branson's revenge wasn't random. It was personal. Every death was a message, every symbol a memory-turned weapon. He stopped outside the general store. The door hung open, which shouldn't have been possible. Old Man Fletcher was a cautious sort, always locking up before dusk. The sheriff called out, "Fletcher, you in there?" Silence. Just the faint buzzing of flies. He stepped inside, his boots crunching over shattered glass. The shelves were overturned, and sugar spilled across the floor like snow. In the center of the mess lay Fletcher, throat cut, head resting peacefully on a stack of coffee tins. Beside him, carved into the counter, was another message. "We keep our promises." The sheriff staggered back, gripping the doorframe for balance. He wanted to call for help, but there was no one left brave enough to answer. Claybrook wasn't a town anymore. It was a ghost story still unfolding. He whispered Edward's name like a curse, then took off down the street, the horse's hooves pounding against the dirt. By midday, he reached the edge of town, beyond the cotton fields and into the woods where the old plantation once stood. The Branson estate had long been abandoned. Windows boarded, roof sagging yet still standing like a relic that refused to die. He dismounted and approached cautiously. Dust hung in the air, shimmering like fog. Inside, the walls were marked with scratches, dozens of tally marks etched deep into the wood, each one clean, deliberate. The count stopped at 13. 13 names, 13 victims. Edward had been keeping record. In the hallway, something glinted in the half-light, a photograph nailed to the wall. The sheriff stepped closer. In the faded image, a group of soldiers stood beside the smouldering remains of a barn. His barn. He saw himself in the photo. Younger, uniform crisp and face proud. Beside him, kneeling with his head bowed, was Edward, dirt-streaked and shackled. And behind them, in the smoke, 3 women burnt beyond recognition. He tore the photo down, chest tight, eyes stinging. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The truth clawed its way back to him, the order he gave that day, the choice to make an example out of the defiant ones. He remembered Edward's silence as the flames rose, his eyes reflecting not grief but promise. That was the birth of this story, he realized. Not 1901, not the killings. It began in that field 20 years ago with one command he could never undo. The sound of footsteps broke his trance. Soft, measured, closer. He turned, reaching for his revolver, but a voice stopped him. "Sheriff," Edward said calmly from the doorway. "I knew you'd come." He stepped into the light, lean, composed, coat dripping from the morning rain. His face carried the same faint smile it always did, but now it looked heavier, almost mournful. "You remember now," Edward said. "Took you long enough." "Edward," the sheriff said, voice trembling, "you don't have to do this." Edward tilted his head. "Don't I?" "You burned them. My wife, my mother, my sister, and you called it duty." The words struck like gunshots. "I followed orders," the sheriff said weakly. "It was war. And this," Edward replied, stepping closer, "is mine." The 2 men stood in silence, the house creaking around them like an old, dying beast. The sheriff finally raised his weapon, hands shaking. "Don't make me, Edward." Edward smiled wider, eyes shining. "You already did." Outside, the wind pushed through the trees, carrying the echo of 1,000 unsaid words. The sheriff fired once. The blast tore through the still air, scattering birds into the sky. But when the smoke cleared, Edward was gone. Only the door swinging wide and footsteps fading into the woods. The sheriff stumbled forward, heart pounding, shouting Edward's name into the wind. No answer. Only that laugh again, soft, fleeting, like a man remembering something dear. By the time he reached the riverbank, the sun had dipped low. The current ran red with mud, maybe more. In the distance, against the horizon, a single column of black smoke rose from town. The sheriff dropped to his knees, the truth pressing down with unbearable weight. Every step, every death had led him here, to this reckoning. And somewhere beyond the trees, Edward smiled once more, already choosing who would die next. By the time the sheriff rode back into Claybrook, the town was burning. Flames reached high into the night sky, consuming rooftops and barns, cracking wood like gunshots. Smoke rolled thick over the streets, choking out the stars. The heat was alive, feral, roaring with the voices of the past. And in that inferno, the sheriff saw what Edward had promised. Judgment, delivered one house at a time. People ran screaming, clutching children and possessions that wouldn't save them. He jumped off his horse and stormed toward the flames, shouting orders no one followed. Panic had stripped every man of sense. Buckets clattered uselessly. Tears mixed with soot. Claybrook, once proud and quiet, now sounded like a battlefield all over again. "Where is he?" the sheriff demanded. "Where's Edward Branson?" No one answered, but everyone looked toward the hills, toward the faint silhouette that stood watching from afar, tall, still, framed by moonlight and fire. Edward. The sheriff ran after him, boots sinking into mud, lungs burning with smoke. He crossed the empty fields and followed the glow through the trees. The air turned cool again under the leaves, a merciless contrast to the heat behind him. Branches whipped against his face, dew mixing with blood on his cheek. Deeper and deeper he went, until the woods opened into the old quarry, silent and black as night itself. Edward was waiting there, sitting on a flat stone beside the water. The reflection of the flames danced across his face, that faint smile still carved there, but softer now, nearly tired. "You came," he said, without looking up. "I came to end this," the sheriff answered, gun in hand. "Too many have died." Edward turned his head slowly, eyes glinting in the dim light. "Too many died long before tonight, Sheriff. You just didn't bury them proper. Revenge won't bring them back." "No," Edward said, "but maybe it'll make you feel what I felt when I smelled their flesh burn, when I heard your soldiers laugh." The sheriff's grip tightened. "I was trying to survive." "So was I," Edward whispered. For a moment the world went still. The fire crackled in the distance. The river sighed. Two men, both scarred by history, both chained to it, stared across the years that divided them. One carried guilt, the other grief, and neither knew how to let go. Edward rose slowly, stepping closer, his bare feet silent on the wet stone. His hands hung loose by his side, no weapon visible. "Shoot me," he said. "Make it clean like you couldn't back then. Finish your war." The sheriff raised the revolver, hand trembling. The years fell away in an instant. The screams, the smoke, the orders barked under a red sky. He saw not a killer before him, but the boy from the field, still kneeling, still silent. For the first time he understood the truth. He hadn't ended the war at all. He'd just passed its pain forward. "I can't," the sheriff murmured. Edward stepped closer, inches away now. "Then I'll do what you couldn't." A blade flashed from his sleeve. It caught the moonlight just long enough for the sheriff to react. The gun fired, once, twice. The echo rolled through the trees like thunder. Edward staggered but didn't fall at first. He smiled again, faint, almost peaceful, before collapsing onto the stone beside the river. The sheriff dropped to his knees, chest heaving. The revolver slipped from his hand. He watched Edward breathe slowly, blood blooming beneath him. His voice was soft when he spoke again. "Oh, you finally pulled the trigger," Edward said with a weak chuckle. "Guess we both remembered." "Why, Edward?" the sheriff asked, tears streaking through the soot on his face. Edward's eyes flickered toward the flames painting the horizon. "Because pain's the only thing folks in Claybrook ever shared," he whispered. "Now maybe they'll stop pretending they're better than what made them." His lips curled into that same haunting smile. "Now we're the same, Sheriff. Both sinners, both free." His eyes drifted shut. The sheriff sat there long after the smoke faded, long after the screams turned to silence. He buried Edward near the river, marking the grave with one of the wooden crosses Edward had left behind. And when dawn came, Claybrook lay in ruins, a map of every sin the town had tried to forget. He returned to Main Street, ash clinging to his boots. The air smelled of wet earth and death. As he passed the church, the hanging cross above the door creaked in the wind, tilting to one side until it finally snapped. It fell, shattering at his feet. The sheriff didn't flinch. He just looked east, where the morning light touched the horizon, and whispered, "You're free now, Edward." I hope that's enough. But deep down he knew the truth. The fire would never really die. It lived in the soil, in the stories, in the memory of the man who smiled while killing. It lived in Claybrook, and it always would. When the fires finally died, Claybrook was unrecognizable. The air hung heavy with smoke and grief. Whole streets were gone, reduced to cinders, iron nails, and blackened foundations. The survivors moved slowly through the ruins, not speaking, as if words might wake something that still lingered in the ash. The silence was the only thing stronger than the smell of death. Sheriff Randall Price walked among them, a ghost among ghosts. His uniform was torn, his face drawn, his hands trembling from exhaustion and guilt. He had buried Edward Branson with his own hands by the river, but it hadn't brought him peace. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that final smile, the one that said the story wasn't over, not really. By the third morning, the townspeople began rebuilding what they could. Men hauled debris, women gathered what little food remained. But the sheriff noticed something strange in their eyes. They weren't angry at Edward anymore. They feared what he revealed, how fragile everything had been beneath their pride. In whispers, they called him the Reckoner, the one who showed the truth hidden under their lives. At the edge of town, Dr. Collins set up a makeshift infirmary. Burns, cuts, shock. He treated what was possible, and for the rest he poured whiskey and prayed. The sheriff helped where he could, moving bodies, comforting widows. But every time he passed someone clutching a Bible or muttering Edward's name, he felt judgment in their silence. By noon, the preacher gathered what remained of his flock outside the half-charred church. The bell was gone, melted into a warped mass of metal, but he spoke beneath its blackened frame anyway. "We've seen sin," he said, voice trembling, "but let it end here." He looked directly at the sheriff. Claybrook must choose forgiveness, not vengeance. Forgiveness. The word felt like acid. The sheriff turned away. He followed the dirt road leading north to the river, the same path Edward had taken countless nights before. The closer he came, the quieter the world grew. Birds avoided this place. Even the water seemed slower, darker. When he reached the shallow grave, he knelt beside it. Edward's cross still stood rough and crooked, but something new lay carved into the soil beneath it, words scratched with a stick, still damp from morning dew. The river keeps secrets, but not forever. The sheriff's throat tightened. He looked toward the water and saw for a moment a shape under the surface. He blinked and it was gone. Maybe debris, maybe not. He rose, hand on his revolver, though he knew the weapon meant nothing anymore. Not against memories, not against ghosts of conscience. That night he couldn't sleep. The town was blanketed in darkness, save for a few lanterns flickering weakly in windows. The ground was still warm where buildings had burned. He sat outside his office, staring at the stars. They looked dimmer now. A child passed by, barefoot, holding a tin pail. "Mama said the fire's gone," the boy told him. "Does that mean he's gone too?" The sheriff didn't answer. The boy waited, then walked away. He thought about leaving Claybrook, riding east, disappearing like so many before him. But every road out passed the river, and he couldn't face crossing it, not knowing what might watch from the opposite bank. At dawn, a knock came at his door. It was the preacher again, hat in hand, his face pale. "We found something," he said. They walked together through the fields, still damp with dew and ash. Behind the old Branson property, near the charred skeleton of the house, they found a pit. Not wide, but deep. Inside lay remains, bones, dozens of them, tangled and blackened. Old remains, not victims of the recent fires. Judging by the rotted cloth and shackles, they had been there for decades. The preacher crossed himself. "The slaves," he whispered. "The ones no one ever accounted for." The sheriff stood still, the world around him spinning. He understood now what Edward had meant. The rivers, the secrets, the reckoning. These weren't Edward's victims. These were his ancestors, his proof. The earth itself had carried their memory while Claybrook forgot. Back in town, when word spread, the silence deepened again. No one wept. No one prayed. They just stared at the sheriff as if seeing him for the first time, not as their protector, but as the last witness of everything they'd chosen to hide. That evening, he packed his revolver, his hat, and one wooden cross. As the sun sank into the horizon, he rode north, leaving the town behind. No one stopped him. No one said goodbye. At the riverbank, he dismounted and looked once more at the grave. "You were right, Edward," he said quietly. "They'll never forgive us. And maybe they shouldn't." He threw the badge into the water. It sank without a ripple. When he looked up again, the air shimmered faintly with heat, and for just a moment he could swear he saw Edward standing on the opposite shore, calm, still, smiling. Then the image drifted apart with the mist, leaving only the flow of the river and the whisper of wind through the reeds. Claybrook would rebuild, but it would never forget. Some fires burn the soul, not the land. And Edward Branson's smile, even in death, had left a scar that would outlive every man who tried to forget it. 20 years had passed since Edward Branson's death, yet Claybrook had never escaped his shadow. Time had smoothed over the town's scars, but could not silence its memories. Even after 2 decades, people walked the streets with caution, their steps slower near the riverbank, their laughter restrained, as though joy itself still required permission to exist. They rebuilt their homes, repainted their porches, even reopened the church, but under every nail, beneath every coat of fresh paint, the past waited patiently, whispering. The old generation knew the truth and chose to bury it beneath false peace. The new generation grew up with stories their parents called superstition, about the fire that almost wiped out the town, the sheriff who disappeared afterward, and the man who smiled while killing. Teachers avoided the subject entirely, referring to those years only as the time of sorrow. But every child in Claybrook knew the name that no adult would say out loud. Edward Branson, the ghost without a grave marker, the slave who went to war with a smile. Some nights when the wind came off the river, mothers would hear quiet laughter drifting through the cattails, soft, faint, and distant. They told their children it was only the frogs, but everyone in Claybrook knew frogs didn't laugh. The strongest refused to admit fear, though no one lingered by the water after sunset. The river was different now. Its current no longer ran straight. It bent, curved, and slowed near the bend where Edward had been buried. The fishermen called it the still patch. Their lines often caught there, tugging on something below that never came loose. One of those fishermen, a man named Abraham Carter, had been a boy when the fires came. He remembered Edward's eyes from across the fields, calm, heavy, almost tired. "He ain't left us," Abraham used to say, spitting tobacco into the mud. "He's just waitin' till we learn what we done." Most ignored him. Others silently agreed. Claybrook changed on the surface, but never at its core. The cotton fields became corn, the horse trails turned to dirt roads, and a single telephone wire stretched crookedly down Main Street. Yet the rhythm of fear remained. People lived quietly, worked early, prayed often, and never asked too much about anyone's family history. When strangers passed through, the townsfolk smiled politely but kept them from wandering too far. If someone mentioned the plantation ruins or the burning of 1901, conversation dropped quick like a trapdoor closing. In August 1921, the summer air lay thick over Claybrook. It was the kind of heat that made the world shimmer at noon, when even the flies seemed to give up. On one such day, Elias Ward, the preacher's grandson, wandered alone toward the river. He was 13, barefoot, curious, restless in the way only boys untouched by real fear can be. His grandfather had warned him about the place for as long as he could remember. "That river don't forgive, boy," he used to say. "It remembers more than God himself." Elias never understood what that meant, and like every child before him, he decided to find out for himself. The woods around the river were overgrown now, swallowed by vines and husks of decaying trees. The air smelled of mud and iron. When he reached the water, it looked calm at first, greenish-brown, glittering under the sun. Elias skipped a stone. It bounced twice and sank, leaving ripples that spread lazily to the far shore. He bent to grab another rock, but when he stood up again, he noticed something strange. The ripples hadn't faded. They kept moving, wider and faster, though the air was still. Then came the sound, faint, lilting, and unmistakable. It was laughter, low and steady, echoing over the water. Elias froze. His heart pounded so loud he could hear it in his ears. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. The sound died as suddenly as it had come. He took a step back, eyes locked on the still surface. That was when he saw it, a wooden cross half buried in the mud a few feet away. He crouched and brushed off the dirt. The carving was old but sharp. E.B. nothing else. The ground beneath him trembled softly as if exhaling. The river water near the bend bubbled. Panic shot through him. He turned to run, but his foot caught on something. A root, he thought at first. When he looked down, it wasn't a root, but a length of rusted iron chain emerging from the ground like an old snake. He yanked his leg free, bolting toward town, the sound of the rushing river chasing behind him all the way. By evening, everyone in Claybrook had heard the boy's story. Some claimed the cross was real. Others said the heat had gotten to him. But curiosity is stronger than fear, and the next morning a handful of men rowed out to the river to see for themselves. What they found was true enough to silence every doubter forever. Where the water curved near the still patch, the soil had collapsed, revealing something beneath the roots, dozens of bones tangled together, shackles still clinging to a few. The chains were thick with rust but unmistakable. They weren't Edward's victims. They were his blood, his people, those buried long before the fires, long before freedom. The river had kept their secret until it couldn't anymore. The preacher stood among the men, his hat pressed to his chest, silent tears mixing with the sweat on his face. "He warned us," he whispered. "All those years ago he warned us. That night Claybrook gathered at the church. The new bell tolled twice, slow and heavy. No one spoke Edward's name, but their faces told his story. For the first time in 2 decades, the town seemed to truly see what had been done, and what still haunted them. Ashes may cool, but guilt never does. When dawn broke, the river looked peaceful again, as if nothing had happened. Yet those who looked closely swore they saw a figure standing across the bank, a shadow darker than the trees, still, silent, watching. And though no one dared speak it aloud, they all felt the same truth rise in their chests. Edward Branson had never really left. He had simply been waiting for them to remember. By the time another summer came, Claybrook was no longer a town of secrets. It was a town of silence. The river that had once sustained life now marked a border between what was living and what refused to rest. The townspeople rebuilt again as they always did, but something invisible pressed down on their shoulders. Even the sky seemed duller, as if the earth itself had tired of forgiving them. The remains found near the bend had changed everything. For a time, there were plans to rebury them properly, to build a monument to give peace to those whose names had never been spoken. But hesitation was the strongest force the town had left. No one wanted to dig too deep again. No one wanted to face what they might still find. Weeks passed, and the river continued to whisper. The preacher tried to lead prayers there once, but the sound of moving water swallowed his voice. When the small wooden cross marking Edward Branson's grave vanished with a night storm, most took it as a sign. "He's done waiting," Abraham Carter murmured. "Now it's our turn." Nobody responded. They just looked toward the horizon, where thunder built behind the hills. One evening, as the sun dropped low and red across the cornfields, the town council gathered in the church. The air inside felt wrong, oppressive, heavy with memory. They spoke of how to move forward, whether to bring new settlers in, whether to tear down the last remains of the old Branson house. Words tangled, tempers rose. Then an older woman named Clara Hensley stood and said what everyone was thinking but feared to say. "It don't matter what we build," she said. "We keep mending the wood, but rot stays underneath." Maybe he was right to burn it. Silence followed. No one argued. That night, the meeting ended before dark. The doors locked behind them with a quiet click. No one returned to the church for days. The younger folks began leaving not long after. The railroad had reopened routes west, promising land without history. Wagons rolled down Main Street carrying mattresses, trunks, and worn faces, turned away from the river. Each departure left another house empty, another window dark. By autumn, barely 50 people remained in Claybrook. The rest had chosen to forget by leaving. For those who stayed, the nights grew stranger. Lamps flickered in perfect rhythm. Dogs barked at water they couldn't see, and sometimes a knock echoed on doors long after curfew. The sheriff's old office reopened briefly under a man named Dalton Reeves, but he lasted only 2 months before vanishing the same way his predecessor had. Horse gone, rifle missing, tracks ending at the riverbank. The preacher grew sick that winter. In his final sermon, his voice cracked with fever but carried an odd calm. "Forgiveness," he said, "ain't something the living give. It's what the dead allow." He died 2 nights later, and when they buried him, the ground around his grave turned black with moisture that never dried. By the next spring, Claybrook was half empty and wholly hollow. A new family from St. Louis arrived seeking farmland, but left within a week, muttering about noises after midnight and smiling in the dark. Rumors spread that the water's reflection sometimes showed faces that weren't there, men and women standing behind you with faint, endless grins. Then came the night the river rose again. Rain poured without pause for 3 days. The water swelled past its banks, clawing at the soil until it devoured Edward's burial site entirely. By morning, half the cemetery had caved in. The current carried bones downstream, scattering them through the marshlands. People hesitated to collect them. Some said it was the river setting its own dead free at last. In the days that followed, the preacher's grandson, Elias, now grown, returned from Kansas City. He stood by the ruins and watched the water twist through the valley. The old fear hadn't left him but had changed shape, no longer terror but understanding. Claybrook wasn't cursed, he thought. It was condemned by memory. He walked down to the water's edge, picked up a fragment of iron chain that had washed loose, and dropped it into the river. "Rest," he whispered. "Please." Behind him, lightning flashed far away, painting the horizon in white. For just a heartbeat, Elias thought he saw the outline of 2 men standing across the current, one tall and proud, one wearing a sheriff's hat. Both still, both silent, both looking toward the town. When the next dawn came, Claybrook lay untouched. The air smelled clean, the sky opened wide. The river, for the first time in half a century, ran smooth and clear. People claimed the sound of laughter had finally stopped. The fields grew greener that year, the crops heavy and sweet. But every few months someone walking alone would pause at the bend, feeling eyes on their back, hearing the faint trickle of chains beneath the water. Time moved on, as it always does. Roads came, factories rose, generations shifted. Claybrook was renamed, its story folded into the pages of forgotten history. Yet if you visit the river during a quiet night and listen closely, you might still hear the current hum beneath the surface. Not sadness, not rage, just remembrance. And in that whisper, soft and steady, the echo of a man remains. The smile of Edward Branson, gentle as peace, patient as the truth, enduring far beyond the fire. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.